If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's begin. The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon, cutting through the silence of the Portland mansion like a blade. On the other end, Margaret's voice trembled with an urgency that made her words stumble over each other. She had worked for the Harrison family for nearly 6 years, long enough to know when something was desperately wrong. "Please," she begged, "come home before it's too late." But William Harrison, successful tech entrepreneur and widower, had heard this kind of plea before. Margaret was devoted, yes, but she had always been overprotective of the girls. He assured her everything was fine, that she was worrying too much, and ended the call with a promise to check in later. William believed his life had finally found its rhythm again. After 2 years of navigating the fog of grief following his wife Sarah's passing, he had rebuilt something that resembled normalcy. His company was thriving, landing contracts that pushed him further into the upper echelons of Portland's business elite. And then there was Vanessa, elegant and charming, who had entered his world like a breath of fresh air at a charity gala. She was everything he thought he needed, sophisticated, attentive, and seemingly enchanted by his 3 daughters. The triplets, Emma, Lily, and Sophie, had just turned 5 when their mother's absence became permanent. Each girl carried that loss differently. Emma, once the chatterbox of the trio, asked endless questions about heaven and angels. Lily became watchful, her wide eyes tracking every movement in the house as if searching for something she had lost. Sophie created small rituals, arranging her stuffed animals in the exact same pattern every night, a desperate attempt to control a world that had proven chaotic and cruel. Margaret had been there for all of it. She had held them through nightmares, learned to distinguish between their different cries, and filled the enormous spaces of the Harrison home with warmth that William, drowning in his own sorrow and professional obligations, could not provide. When Vanessa arrived, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this elegant woman with her easy smile and designer clothes could become what the girls needed. The first month seemed promising. Vanessa brought gifts wrapped in beautiful paper, complimented the drawings that covered the refrigerator, and insisted on family dinners where she would listen, seemingly captivated, to the girls' rambling stories about preschool and playground adventures. William watched these scenes with relief, bordering on euphoria. His daughters would have a mother figure again. He could finally breathe. But masks, no matter how carefully crafted, eventually slip. The change started small, a look that turned cold the moment William's back was turned, a grip on Emma's arm that was just a little too tight, a comment delivered in honeyed tones that somehow made Sophie's eyes fill with tears. Vanessa began testing boundaries in the spaces where no one else could see. She would accidentally break a favorite toy, then sweetly suggest the child had been careless. She whispered that remembering their mother too much was unhealthy, that they needed to move on. She began pitting the sisters against each other with calculated precision, telling Emma she was the smartest, informing Lily she was difficult, and burdening Sophie with the responsibility of keeping her sisters in line so they wouldn't disappoint their father. Each word was chosen to wound without leaving visible marks. The triplets began to change in ways that Margaret noticed immediately. Emma's constant chatter dwindled to silence. Lily, always observant, now walked with her eyes fixed on the floor. Sophie stopped inventing elaborate games with her toys, leaving them untouched in their perfectly arranged rows. The laughter that had slowly returned to the Harrison home after Sarah's passing began to fade again, replaced by a tension that made the girls' small bodies seem to shrink whenever Vanessa entered a room. Margaret tried to tell William. She pulled him aside one evening after the girls had gone to bed, her voice low and urgent. "The girls are afraid," she said. "Vanessa is not who you think she is. When you're gone, she's cruel to them." William, still wrapped in the warmth of new love and desperate to believe he had found salvation for his broken family, dismissed her concerns. "Children are jealous," he said. "They're resistant to change. You're reading too much into normal adjustment struggles." When Margaret's calls became more insistent, describing incidents that painted a darker picture, William's patience wore thin. It was easier to see exaggeration in the pleas of a housekeeper than to admit his choice might be destroying his daughters. Inside the mansion, a quiet regime of terror had begun. Vanessa implemented rules with a leather-bound notebook and an expensive pen. She made the triplets recite in unison that they were not allowed to speak badly of her, that they must not make noise, that they should be grateful for whatever food they received, no matter how little. If they stumbled over a word, breakfast was taken away. If they cried, they were called dramatic, unbearable, dead weight. Punishments became routine, standing in corners for hours, being locked in a dark room, going to bed without dinner for absurd infractions like a spilled glass of water or a toy left on the floor. Margaret, her heart breaking, did what many people in her position must do to be taken seriously. She began collecting evidence. She hid her phone on top of the refrigerator, filming the humiliations in the kitchen. She photographed untouched plates, documented marks on small arms, wrote down dates, times, and words no child should ever hear. One day, she recorded something even more devastating. The three girls, sitting side by side, describing what happened when their father was away. They spoke of destroyed toys, nights without food, insults about their mother, and threats that they would be abandoned if they dared tell the truth. Margaret's hands shook as she tried one final time to show William the evidence. She had organized everything meticulously: videos, photographs, written accounts with timestamps. She caught him one evening in his study, the door half open, and approached with the determination of someone who knows this is her last chance. He barely glanced at the screen before pushing it away. His face flushed with anger as he accused her of invading his privacy, of manipulating his daughters, of trying to sabotage his relationship. Instead of listening, he gave her 2 weeks' notice. The only adult who truly saw the triplets as whole human beings was being removed from the house, treated as a threat rather than a shield. Desperate and terrified for the girls, Margaret reached out beyond the mansion's walls. She contacted Dr. Robert Chen, the family physician who had known the Harrisons for years, and Emily Torres, a child psychologist connected to the girls' preschool. She sent them everything: the videos, the written reports, the photographs. As professionals, they recognized immediately what Margaret had been seeing all along: clear signs of emotional manipulation, nutritional neglect, and psychological terror. Dr. Chen requested a meeting with William, turned his laptop around at a coffee shop downtown, and let the images speak for themselves. William watched his daughter Sophie, the one he considered the strongest, talking about fear and hunger. He saw Emma flinch at a raised voice. He observed Lily's hollow eyes, and then he closed the laptop, called it fabrication, and threatened legal action. He severed professional relationships that had lasted years, choosing to protect the illusion of the perfect woman rather than face the collapse of his daughter's well-being. Margaret was escorted from the Harrison mansion on a cold October night with a single suitcase and a flash drive full of ignored evidence. From the top of the stairs, Vanessa watched with a victor's smile. Upstairs, 3 little girls learned the cruelest lesson of all. No one was willing to listen to them. Without their ally, the cruelty expanded into every corner of their lives. Meals were reduced to portions so small the girls began to look gaunt. The triplets became outlets for Vanessa's every frustration. If one made a mistake, all 3 were punished. She created impossible rules, and when any child failed to meet them, she would call them burdens, ungrateful, responsible for their mother's passing. William, consumed by meetings, business trips, and the demands of maintaining his status, accepted the ready-made explanations. They're throwing tantrums. They miss the old housekeeper. They're manipulating us with sadness. It was easier to believe. At Riverside Preschool, the changes caught attention. Mrs. Anderson, their teacher, noticed that the 3 girls who had been full of energy were now listless. Their drawings, once filled with sunshine and playground scenes, now featured tiny figures surrounded by dark shadows. Emma barely spoke anymore. Lily cried without apparent reason. Sophie had taken on a parental role, constantly trying to control her sisters to avoid causing problems. Mrs. Anderson filed her concerns with the school administrator, but without visible physical marks and without a responsible adult willing to investigate, everything became bureaucratic notation, swallowed by a system that fails children like these every single day. The turning point arrived on an ordinary Friday in November. William forgot an important contract at home and decided to return without calling ahead. When he entered the mansion, he was struck by the unusual silence. He climbed the stairs, and as he approached the girl's bedroom, he heard muffled crying. Through a crack in the door, he saw Vanessa gripping Emma by the arms while Lily and Sophie cowered in the corner, watching in terror. Vanessa threw a stuffed bear to the floor, called the girls a disgrace to the family, and raised her hand to strike. The children did not even cry anymore. They had learned that crying brought worse punishment. In that single instant, William saw what he had refused to see in all the messages, calls, and warnings that had come before. The fantasy crumbled. He burst into the room, ordered Vanessa away from his daughters, and saw up close their sunken eyes, their too thin bodies, the fear embedded in every small muscle. When he tried to embrace the triplets, they remained rigid, as if affection was something strange, suspicious, dangerous. Sophie apologized. Emma asked in a whisper if he was going to send Margaret away again because of them. Lily just trembled, trying not to make any sound. Overwhelmed by guilt, he finally understood the magnitude of the damage. If you were in William's position, and you discovered you had been so blind to your children's suffering, what would you do first? Tell us in the comments. What followed was the inevitable confrontation in the mansion's living room. Vanessa, experienced in manipulating narratives, tried to position herself as the victim. She spoke of discipline, boundaries, jealousy from a bitter former employee. When she realized she had lost control over this man, she dropped the mask entirely. She revealed her contempt for the girls, mocked William for being so easy to deceive, reminded him there were no visible marks, that she was well connected, that the system typically believes eloquent adults over confused children. For the first time, he did not back down. He did not accept promises to have change. He demanded she leave the house immediately, prepared to face gossip, lawsuits, threats, anything except watching his daughters be destroyed inside their own home. He called the police to document the confrontation, not to press charges, but to create a record. He contacted his attorney to ensure Vanessa could never claim rights to his home or access to his children. And then, with hands that shook more than he wanted to admit, he made the call he should have made months ago. Margaret answered on the first ring. He did not offer justifications, only recognition of his own blindness. He asked her to come back, not as just another employee, but as someone essential to rebuilding these children's lives. There was a long silence before she agreed, with one condition, that he would truly listen this time, to her and to his daughters. Margaret returned to the Harrison mansion on a grey Saturday morning, carrying the same worn suitcase she had left with and a heart full of cautious hope. The girls were in the kitchen when she walked through the door. For a moment nobody moved. Then Emma's face crumpled and she ran, followed immediately by her sisters. The three of them crashed into Margaret with such force she had to steady herself against the doorframe. They clung to her like drowning swimmers finding solid ground, and for the first time in months, they cried the kind of tears that bring relief instead of punishment. William watched from the hallway, seeing clearly what his pride had nearly destroyed. These were his daughters, and they had been screaming for help in every way they knew how, while he had chosen to believe a stranger over the people who loved them most. The weight of that realization would stay with him for the rest of his life. The recovery that followed was not magical, and it certainly was not quick. William cleared his schedule, something he had never done before, and took the girls to Dr. Chen's office that same Monday. The physician's examination revealed moderate malnutrition and several other concerning signs. Emma weighed significantly less than she should. Lily showed symptoms of chronic stress. Sophie displayed behaviors consistent with a child forced to take on adult responsibilities far too young. Dr. Chen referred them to Emily Torres, the child psychologist, and recommended regular check-ins to monitor their physical and emotional progress. The first therapy session was heartbreaking. Sophie would not sit down, standing guard near the door, as if ready to protect her sisters from another threat. Emma refused to speak, communicating only through drawings that depicted small figures trapped in dark spaces. Lily watched everyone with the wariness of someone who had learned that adults could not be trusted. Emily Torres did not rush them. She understood that healing required patience, consistency, and above all, safety. At home, Margaret worked to restore routines that had been shattered. She prepared meals at regular times, making sure the girls understood that food was no longer a reward or punishment, but simply something they deserved. The first few days they ate like they might never see food again, hoarding crackers in their pockets and hiding fruit under their beds. Margaret gently explained that there would always be breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that they did not need to save or hide anything. It took weeks before they believed her. William tried to reconnect with daughters who barely knew him anymore. He had been present in their lives physically, but Vanessa had created such a climate of fear that the girls associated his presence with danger. He was the person who had not believed them, who had sent Margaret away, who had chosen his own happiness over their safety. Rebuilding that trust meant starting from nothing. He began by simply sitting with them, not demanding conversation or affection, just being there. He read books aloud at bedtime, even when they turned their backs to him. He attended their therapy sessions when Emily thought it would help, listening to truths that cut him to his core. In one session, Lily finally spoke. She described the notebook where Vanessa had written rules, the recitations they had to perform, the hours spent standing in corners. She talked about being so hungry that her stomach hurt, about watching Emma get locked in the closet for crying, about the night Sophie was punished because Lily had accidentally broken a glass. William listened without interrupting, tears running down his face as he understood the full scope of what had happened under his own roof, while he had been too blind and too arrogant to see. Sophie revealed something even more painful. She explained how she had tried to be perfect, to keep her sisters quiet and obedient, believing that if she could just follow all the rules, Vanessa would stop hurting them. She had taken on the role of protector at 5 years old because the actual adults in her life had failed. The responsibility had been crushing, and she still carried it, constantly monitoring her sister's behavior, terrified that one mistake would bring back the nightmare. Emma's disclosure came through her drawings. In session after session, she drew the same scene. 3 small girls, a dark figure looming over them, and in the corner, always in the corner, a sad face that Emily eventually realized represented their deceased mother. Emma believed in the magical thinking way that young children do, that her mother had left because Emma had been bad. Vanessa had reinforced this belief, telling the girls that their mother would be ashamed of them, that they were disappointments. Emily worked carefully to untangle these painful lies from the truth, helping Emma understand that her mother's passing had nothing to do with anything she had done or failed to do. Mrs. Anderson at Riverside Preschool noticed changes too. Slowly, cautiously, the triplets began to emerge from their shells. Emma started participating in circle time again. Lily played with other children during recess instead of sitting alone. Sophie began to let go of her hypervigilance, allowing herself to be a child rather than a tiny adult. The teacher coordinated with Emily Torres and Margaret to ensure consistency between home and school, creating a web of support around 3 little girls who desperately needed to know they were safe. But healing is never a straight line. There were setbacks that broke William's heart all over again. One evening, he raised his voice in frustration over a work call, and all 3 girls immediately scattered, hiding in their room with the door locked. It took Margaret 20 minutes to coax them out, and another hour before they would come near him. He learned that night that his daughters were still carrying the scars of his failure, and that regaining their trust would require more patience than he had ever had to practice before. There were nightmares that shattered the quiet of their home. Emma would wake screaming that Vanessa was coming back. Lily developed a fear of being alone in any room. Sophie had panic attacks when meal times were delayed, convinced that food was being withheld as punishment. Margaret and William took turns sitting with them through the long nights, offering comfort and reassurance that slowly, gradually, began to take root. 6 months after Vanessa's departure, the Harrison household had found a new rhythm, one built on honesty rather than illusion. William had fundamentally changed his approach to fatherhood. He cut back his work hours, declining opportunities that would have once seemed essential. He hired additional support staff to handle business matters that did not require his personal attention, freeing him to be present for school pickups, therapy appointments, and the ordinary moments that constitute a childhood. He was learning, slowly and with many stumbles, that being wealthy meant nothing if his daughters did not feel safe and loved. The triplets were making progress, each at her own pace. Emma had started talking again, though her sentences were still careful and measured, as if she was testing whether her words would bring punishment or acceptance. She had developed a love for painting during art therapy sessions, creating bright, colorful works that Emily Torres saw as evidence of healing. The dark, frightening images had given way to rainbows and flowers, and most tellingly, pictures of 4 people. 3 small girls and a smiling woman who looked remarkably like Margaret. Lily's watchfulness had softened into simple attentiveness. She no longer tracked every movement with the wariness of prey animal. She had made friends at school, including a girl named Hannah who lived 2 blocks away. William had arranged several playdates, watching with wonder and relief as Lily laughed and played dress-up and engaged in the kind of normal childhood activities that had been stolen from her. She still had moments of anxiety, particularly around new people, but they were becoming less frequent and less intense. Sophie had been the slowest to release her burden of responsibility. Even with Margaret back and William more present, she continued trying to manage her sister's behavior, stepping between them and any potential problem. Emily worked with her on understanding that it was not her job to protect everyone, that she was allowed to be a child, to make mistakes, to need help. There was a breakthrough one afternoon when Sophie spilled an entire cup of juice across the kitchen floor. Instead of freezing in terror, instead of bracing for punishment, she looked at Margaret and whispered an apology. Margaret simply handed her paper. Towels helped her clean up and poured another cup. Sophie cried then, not from fear but from relief, and something fundamental shifted inside her. Margaret had become more than an employee. William had insisted on giving her a substantial raise and a new title that reflected her true role in the family. She was family manager, yes, but more importantly, she was the person the girls trusted most in the world. She held their secrets, soothed their fears, and provided the steady, unconditional love they needed to heal. William had learned to defer to her judgment on matters concerning the girls, recognizing that his own instincts had proven devastatingly flawed. The legal situation with Vanessa had resolved itself more quietly than William had anticipated. His attorney had prepared for a battle, gathering all of Margaret's evidence, the professional assessments from Dr. Chen and Emily Torres, and testimony from Mrs. Anderson. But Vanessa, faced with the possibility of her actions becoming public record, had simply disappeared. She signed papers relinquishing any claim to William or his household and left Portland entirely. William heard through mutual acquaintances that she had moved to Seattle and was already charming her way into another wealthy man's life. He thought about warning the man about sharing what he knew, but his attorney advised that without criminal charges, he had no legal standing. He could only hope that somehow someone in that new household would be paying attention. Dr. Chen continued to monitor the girls' physical recovery. Their weights had returned to healthy ranges. Their sleep patterns had improved. The tension that had made their small bodies seem perpetually braced for impact had eased. They were growing again, not just physically, but in all the ways that matter. They were learning to trust, to hope, to believe that the adults in their lives would keep them safe. In therapy, Emily Torres worked on helping the girls process their trauma without being defined by it. She used play therapy, art therapy, and gentle conversation to help them understand that what had happened to them was not their fault, that Vanessa's cruelty reflected her own brokenness and not their worth as human beings. She prepared them for the reality that they might always carry some scars from this period, but that scars did not have to limit them. They could still have full, joyful lives. William's own therapy focused on understanding how he had been so thoroughly deceived and what had made him vulnerable to Vanessa's manipulation. He had to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, that he had wanted so desperately to believe his life could return to normal after Sarah's passing, that he had ignored every warning sign, that his pride had made him dismiss concerns from people he had considered beneath him socially, that his fear of being alone had made him sacrifice his children's well-being. These realizations were painful but necessary. He could not prevent future harm if he did not understand how he had enabled the past harm. One Sunday in late spring, nearly 8 months after that terrible Friday, William took the girls to Forest Park for a picnic. Margaret packed sandwiches and fruit, and they spread a blanket under oak trees that were just beginning to leaf out. The girls played tag, their laughter carrying across the meadow. Emma brought William a handful of wildflowers. Lily asked if they could come back next week. Sophie sat beside Margaret, leaning against her shoulder, finally allowing herself to simply rest. William watched his daughters and felt something he had not felt in years: genuine peace. Not the false calm of denial, but the hard-won tranquility that comes from facing terrible truths and choosing to do better. His life had not returned to what it was before Sarah's passing. It had become something different, something built on honesty and presence, rather than status and appearances. The mansion was still large, but it no longer echoed with loneliness. It had become a home again, filled with the ordinary chaos of childhood. Toys scattered across floors, drawings taped to walls, the smell of Margaret's cooking drifting from the kitchen. The silence had changed its weight, no longer oppressive, but peaceful, the kind of quiet that holds safety rather than fear. William had learned lessons that came at a devastating cost. He learned that loving his children meant more than providing material comfort. It meant listening, truly listening, even when the truth was uncomfortable. It meant believing the powerless over the powerful, the simple over the sophisticated. It meant recognizing that his daughters' voices, however small and uncertain, carried truths he ignored at their peril. Margaret had taught him that real strength often comes wrapped in humility, that the person who cleans your home and cares for your children might see truths that your educated, wealthy friends miss entirely. Dr. Chen and Emily Torres had shown him that professional expertise exists for a reason, that sometimes you need to trust people who know more than you do. Mrs. Anderson had demonstrated that teachers who pay attention can be lifelines for children in crisis, and his daughters, those 3 brave little girls, had taught him the most important lesson of all: that children are resilient, but resilience should never be tested unnecessarily, that they deserved protection, belief, and unconditional love, that his most important legacy would not be his business, success, or his social status, but whether he had given them a childhood worth remembering for the right reasons. As the sun began to set over Portland and the girls chased fireflies across the meadow, William made a promise to himself and to them. He would never again choose his own comfort over their well-being. He would never again dismiss their fears or silence their voices. He would spend the rest of his life ensuring that they knew, beyond any doubt, that they were seen, heard, believed, and cherished. The story of the Harrison family was not one of perfect healing. The scars remained, visible in Sophie's occasional hypervigilance, in Emma's careful words, in Lily's wariness around strangers. But it was a story of redemption, of a father who had failed catastrophically and then chosen to do the painful work of change. It was a story of a woman whose humble position had not stopped her from fighting for 3 voiceless children. It was a story of professionals who had recognized suffering and refused to look away. Most of all, it was the story of 3 little girls who had survived something they should never have experienced, and who were learning day by day that they deserved better. Dear listeners, we hope the Harrison family story touched your heart and opened your eyes to the invisible suffering that can happen behind closed doors. If this story moved you, please click the like button, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments what resonated with you most. Have you ever witnessed someone ignoring a child's cry for help? Have you had to fight to be heard when everyone around you chose to look away? Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest struggles of the human soul and the courage it takes to protect the vulnerable. Your engagement helps these important stories reach more people who need to hear them. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode, and remember, sometimes the quietest voices carry the most important truths.